Okay, so we've moved a very short distance to the northwest from the previous stop, but we've passed into a geologically very distinct and different zone of the Appalachians from the previous stop. What we're looking at here are sandstones. These are probably uppermost Devonian in age, possibly lowermost Mississippian, but the real story here is the burial depth that these materials reached. It's significantly less than the somewhat slaty rocks we saw in the previous stop, and that's because we've crossed another very significant thrust fault that emplaced those what you might call proto-metamorphic or borderline metamorphic rocks on top of this material, which is most certainly purely sedimentary rock. We're not looking at really any extent of recrystallization here. This is all cemented detrital grains. This material would have been buried less than 10 kilometers at its deepest burial point. The slaty material from the previous stop would have been buried certainly more than 10 kilometers at some point in its history. Another way of visualizing that, or sort of bringing that into the context of how these rock units are laid out, is that slaty material was emplaced into its present position many tens of kilometers along a very high displacement thrust. The material that you see here is part of a distinct thrust mass in the footwall of that slaty stuff. This has not moved nearly as far from its original depositional position, sort of on the edge of Laurentia, or what we today call North America. So we're now fully within the sedimentary Appalachians, what we call a valley and ridge, and even though the previous stops where we look at that borderline metamorphic slate type material looks like part of the valley and ridge topographically, it's just because the rock is very erodible and susceptible to solution where carbonate is exposed. It does produce a topographic valley, but the units that you see just southeast of where we are in the hanging wall of the thrust we just crossed have more in common really with the crystalline sheets on which we started this trip, where you saw the chlorite-rich rocks, the amphibole-rich rocks that were buried 15 kilometers or more and represent sort of the crystalline interior of the Appalachians. And indeed, anywhere you go now to the northwest for literally hundreds of kilometers, the only rock you will see in outcrop is sedimentary material that's been buried less than 10 kilometers, and in many cases, maybe just 5 kilometers or so.